Hi, hello everybody. Welcome back. Truthful Ministry Podcast. This is the first episode of what I'm calling Season 2 of the podcast. We've got a new location. I'm super excited. And our first guest, wonderful first guest today, this is Anna Crasher. It's I have to intentionally not call you Anna Lake. That's always going to be a struggle.
Sometimes people call me Anna Lake Crasher.
Anna Lake Crasher, put the hyphen in there.
Yeah.
But Anna is awesome. Anna's been a part of my story for a long time, low-key. Our lives have been intertwined because we went to church together for a long time, even though I probably never talked to you as much until we got to Wesleyan.
True.
But once we were at Wesleyan, we were students together, and then you accepted a position in leadership there. You've been there for a while. You volunteer at church. You're a wife. You're a soon-to-be mother at some point. So you've got a lot going for you. Anna has just been an awesome person in my life and many of our friends' lives and some of the people who have been on the podcast. She's been just very influential for different reasons.
Well,
and so very excited to have Anna on. But for those of you, you listening who don't maybe know you as much, tell me a little bit about yourself and your story in a brief sense, specifically more about your faith. What's your faith been like growing up? Have you always been in the church, stuff like that?
Yeah, always been in the church, born and raised here in Owensboro, Kentucky. My parents were very influential of saying hey, church is going to be a part of your childhood ultimately until you're able to make the decision of if you don't want it to be a part of your life, but we're going to make it a part of your childhood until you're old enough to make that decision for yourself. So always went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and I always said, you've heard of a childlike faith. I don't say this jokingly, but I knew from a very young age, and even got baptized at 5 years old, that I just knew the God of the universe and knew that I was created by him and for him, and it's just, there was never a point in my life, I know people struggle with doubt and it's a very real thing, but there was never that point for me of questioning why am I here, and also who made me, essentially. So I very much count my blessings of the fact that God gave me that reassurance from a very young age, so I never really struggled with any kind of faith doubt, of really wondering why I'm here or who I came from. So that was my early childhood, and then when I got into youth, I was very involved. I think I pretty much immediately started on the worship team, even leading worship there in youth occasionally. And then after I was getting ready to graduate from high school, I remember asking my youth pastor at the time, that would have been at Owensboro Christian Church here in town. I asked him, I was like, hey, I'm super excited for this next chapter of my life. I'm super excited about college. I'm going to Wesleyan. I'm going to stay here in town. Let me know where I need to go next Sunday, because I was graduating.
Right.
I am no longer in high school, no longer deemed necessarily appropriate to be in the high school ministry. Right. What is next for me? And I remember it to this day. His response was, I don't know. He was like, our church doesn't have a full-fledged young adult or college-aged small group. So you can go to the adult class, which basically is 18 to continually on and on. Maybe 18 to 65, because I do think they had a 65 and up group. And I was just I don't know, it just felt like I got hit by a truck, because all the way leading up into that point of my life, I was super on fire for God and was just let's go in every single part. And I was I want to be involved with students that are my age, living the stage of life that I'm in. And then even more so, I want to continually step into leadership positions to own and grow my faith. And it just felt like a massive roadblock for me of not only not being given the opportunity, but in many ways being told no. It was the first time I'd ever experienced that feeling in my faith life. Yeah. So I went to the community college here in town, Owensboro Community Technical College, for my freshman and sophomore year. I got my associates. Technically, I don't really tell a whole lot of people this because they think it's weird, but technically I started at 16. So by the time I was 18, I had an associate's degree.
That's pretty common nowadays.
Yeah, very, very common. Back then, it wasn't super as common, so I really didn't tell anybody because A, people didn't believe me, and B, is potentially sounded boastful. Yeah. But being homeschooled all the way through high school gave the opportunity, whereas now high schools have a partnership with the KCTCS colleges where it's way more common. So graduating from both high school and college with an associate's degree was huge for me, like as far as the opportunities. And then entering into Wesleyan as a junior at that point, again, wasn't normal for my age to be linked with a junior status. So right off the bat, I felt like a fish out of water, I guess you could say. You know, I don't want to say, it sounds dumb to like be classified as like people's enemies in college by any means, but I was definitely deemed as like the outcast within a lot of my academic classes because I was 2 years younger than everybody else in there. But I was graduating 2 years before them. So that I realized that there was almost like a status quo or even hierarchy that I'd never experienced before within society, not only college. So that, in addition to the fact that for 2 years straight, my freshman and sophomore year of college, I very much was in limbo as far as like my church experience and even my faith experience. It was the first time that I was not actively involved, whether it was a small group or like some type of just like direction. So I was attending every Sunday morning, but outside of that, I'm like, I literally don't have something for me, you know?
Yeah.
So when I started attending Kentucky Wesleyan College, that was around the same time that I think I started attending Bridgepoint Church, I think, because I would have been like 19 years old, roughly. And even at the time, like Bridgepoint didn't have a college ministry. They did have small groups geared toward younger individuals. But even the small group that I ended up in was with like people that were married, people that were single, people that had kids that were 7 years old. So it was like a very large range that you were going from. I was the youngest by far in the small group, and you know, anytime we would get to like prayer requests, and you probably experienced this before, you're like, well, we're going around the circle and so mentioned that like their kid's been sick, or so mentioned that they're having surgery next week, or that they're struggling to like pay their mortgage, or that they're looking for a job. And then it ended up on me, and everybody was like, Anna, do you have anything? And I'm like, well, midterms are next week, but that pales in comparison to what everybody else said, so I don't really want to share that. So a lot of people sometimes say, oh, well, it's super great for people to be in small groups with people of different ages because you can pull different perspectives and learn and grow. I don't disagree with that at all, but there's something to be said of peer-to-peer ministry, where you're in a small group or in a ministry of people that are going through the same stage of life as you. So when you share a struggle or even a victory, it's somebody that is likely equally in that victory or in that struggle at the same time. So it's just way easier to feel comfortable and relatable. So that was something for the longest time that was on my heart, as far as like, God, I feel like you're pulling me in a direction by giving me these different experiences of not necessarily struggle, but uncomfortableness. And then you're posing the question to me after each experience, what would you do to fix this? And I'm like, well, I have no idea. I'm 19 years old. Like, how am I going to fix the world? Because I'm not. Like, I have no money. I have, nothing. But when I started at Wesleyan, I got an email one day. I could not even tell you who emailed me. And basically the description said is the college hired a new director of campus ministries. He would love to meet you all. His name is Sean Toms. Be here on this day at this location, which was like 9 p.m. on a Wednesday. And I'm like, who schedules a meeting at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday? Like, I want to be in bed, basically. Like, be here at this time, this location, if you want to get involved within the new ministry foundation of the college. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for. So I attend the meeting, half asleep, obviously. And the guy walks in and is introducing Sean. The entire time he's talking, I think that this is Sean. Like, whole time. I'm like, this is Sean. Like, I'm gonna like introduce myself. I'm gonna get plugged in, yada yada. And then like 5 minutes later, he's like, oh, by the way, and then here's Sean. And then he just like straight up walks out of the room. Like, I don't see him again. I could not tell you who it was. It could have been Scott Kramer for all I know. I really don't know. So Sean walks in, and lo and behold is this dude that I had seen literally 18 hours before then. And he had opened the door for me on my very first day of class at 7:45 in the morning. after I got off of a 4 a.m. shift at Starbucks, and I was not in the mood to see anybody with any slight of energy or remotely a smile, basically. And I probably mouthed off at him in some way, shape, or form of being both tired and frustrated that he had way more energy than I did because I had been up since 3 in the morning.
Image to picture you mouthing off to Sean Toms.
So I'm like, well, crap, now I literally have to say hello and then I'm sorry within the same breath, you know? And like, I would say the rest is history, so to speak, but I introduced myself, told him, you know, my story up to that point, told him my desire to plug in and honestly to just have a space, you know, a safe space to go to. And he basically said yes to everything. He was like, you know, the sky is ultimately the limit because we're starting fresh. By the end of that academic year, I had already led worship multiple times in chapel, multiple times at the evening service. I may have even shared my story at Stories. And Sean, at that time, was building an intern team of students. And he asked me at the end of my first semester if I wanted to be one of the first 4 interns that CM had. I obviously said yes. I was like, this is what I've been waiting for. Going into my second year as my senior year, basically. Before that semester even started, I don't even know if I ever told you this story or not, to be honest with you. You'll have to tell me. Sean approached me that summer in between my junior and senior year and basically was like, hey, I do this with every senior. Like, it's my job to sit down with you to ask what you're going to do with your life post-graduation.
Yeah.
And I was like, I have no idea. Like, I don't have a job lined up, but isn't that normal, you know? And I was like, I want to do ministry because that's what I'm going to school for. I was a double major in music and religion. But outside of that, like, I was in like 3 different outside internships for like academic credit through the college, one of which was Bridgepoint, one of which was OCC, and then something else I can't remember. But I was like, well, I've been like doing all these things to get experience and, you know, just to add to my resume so that I have a good resume by the time that I graduate, but I have no idea. And
talking about you were a religion major, I'll interrupt just for a second.
Yeah, you're good.
You're the GOAT. I remember, I forget that you were a religion major, but it makes sense because I remember you being in my religion classes.
Yeah.
And there were definitely so many times where you hooked me up and gave me the answers to like the study guides and stuff because like I didn't feel like looking them up. Like we would get the study guides where you had to like look answers up or something yourself, and I was like, I don't want to do this. And I'd see you already had it, and I would just be like so many times in the office just like, Hannah, can you pass me your answers? Like you were clutch. That was cool.
Yeah. And
I think we really were some of the first religion majors there. Like so it was probably just me, you,
it was
Carson.
A new program.
Yeah, it was probably me, you, Carson. And I feel like that might have been it, like at the time, or at least while we were there. Yeah. So that was a very new experience for everybody. So I'm sure you probably faced people being like, "What are you going to do with a religion major?"
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
For sure.
Like they wouldn't, agree with this now, but when I started at Wesley, my parents wanted me to get a business degree, and I actually I started my junior year where my application said business major. I took 1 business class and dropped out like 3 weeks later.
Respect.
It's like, I'm sorry, Mom and Dad, this is not my calling. I am also just not good at this. I'm not, I don't have the business mindset on all of my answers, because one of the business classes that I ended up taking was not just like an A, B, or C answer, but it was like where you write a paragraph as your answer. Yeah. And it was like, well, so-and-so and so-and-so is like in debt this much of their mortgage and like blah, 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 blah. So like, what would you do in response to that? And I would be like, well, I just give them the money, and like I would have a very emotional, not businessy response to it. Like I was literally probably failing. I would lift them up in prayer. Or like I was getting like a C or something. Oh my gosh! And I just remember going to my advisor at the time, who was a business professor, and I just went to her and I was like, I don't think this is it for me. And she's like, I'm so glad you've come to that conclusion, because that's what I wanted to talk to you about. And I was like, no, I'm already there. Like, I wanted to drop the class. I want to change my major, because I was a double major where I was business and music. So I always had music in mind, but I just immediately dropped business and acquired the religion double major. But yeah, so like Sean approached me the summer between my junior and senior year to ask me like, what are you going to do with your life? Like, graduation, X, Y, and Z, yada, yada, yada. And as a joke, like 100% was joking, I was like, well, I was honestly going to ask you for a job. And he just paused for a really long time. And I was like, I was joking. I was straight up joking. You know, like I really love it here. I love college ministry. I feel like in many ways God put a calling on my life, not necessarily like to fix college ministry worldwide, because that is a feat in of itself, but in a way to be a voice within Owensboro, so to speak, or maybe just in general, to bring to light some difficulties for college students, both in and out of the church. And he just stared at me for a really long time, and he was like, well, not to be awkward, but I actually asked you to this meeting because I wanted to offer you a job. And I was just like, jaw to the floor, like, you're joking, you're pulling my leg.
God's plan.
You know? So he was like, well, I really, you know, CM is growing. Back then we called it campus ministries. The past 3 years we've been calling it CM. He was like, CM is growing, and it's growing to the point that, like, I need help, basically. So that chapter of my life entered into a very long waiting period, an unknown period. So without getting too lengthy, like, I did my senior year. Within my senior year, both of my grandparents on my mom's side passed away from cancers. Very brutal. Like, we ended up basically moving into their house to be their caregivers because they didn't want to go to a nursing home or anything like that. So my normal schedule, like, I was still at Starbucks. I'd get up at 4 a.m. from my grandparents' house after, you know, giving them medication all through the night to keep, like, their pain management underneath control. I'd go to Starbucks, then I'd make my 9 or 10 a.m. class, whatever my schedule was, and then I'd go to my internship, and then I'd go to my afternoon classes, then it would go back to my internship, and then normally I would, like, go to an evening service on campus, and then I would drive all the way back to my grandparents' house to, like, help for the evening shift, basically. So in many ways, my senior year, I experienced a lot of burnout that I warned students against, even though looking back, I don't know if I could have changed it necessarily, just because everything happened at once. But by the end of the first semester of my senior year, I was very close to dropping out, and just saying, like,
Dang.
This is not for me. Like, I can't do this. In addition to that, like, with me being a double major in both music and religion, I went to Wesleyan, and I have been honest with a lot of people of this. Like, I went to Wesleyan not even being able to read sheet music, and wanted to be a music major.
Right.
And a lot of people within the music department, with most of the time a good heart set behind it, warned me against being a music major because they knew that I had an uphill battle. And I did. Like, Professor Jewett, he retired this semester, or this year.
One of the goats.
Absolutely phenomenal professor. He literally met with me an hour before every single one of his classes that I had, to basically catch me up. And
that guy's so cool. Like,
never charged me or anything. And I ended up graduating third, like, in the music religion or the music class, essentially, of that academic year, which was the end of my junior year. And he, like, one of my last meetings with him at the end of that year, he was like, you will never know how much you've grown and how much time you've committed to this, but just know, like, I see you, basically. So, and it's just like, that's what you want to hear from a professor ultimately when you're giving that amount of time to try to succeed in something that you feel like God is calling you to. But my senior year, in addition to a whole bunch of, like, just family stuff with my grandparents going on, in addition to Sean both promising me and also not promising me a job, because he basically had to go to the administration and say, I want to create a position.
Yeah, I definitely remember that in-between period where you were very unsure. We were all unsure. It was like we were all kind of, like, rooting for you in the background. But there was just, like, no updates, and it was like, well, like, what more can Sean do? Because we are on a campus, we're a campus ministry, so it's ultimately not up to him necessarily.
Right.
That was definitely an interesting time. I remember
it required a lot of approval.
What's the word? The anxiety, I guess, of just genuinely not knowing.
Yeah, and in addition to that, like, I was promised an RD position, and then as I was packing up, kind of thing, a week later, I was told that they were rescinding the offer of the RD position.
Dude.
And that they had to give it to somebody else because of paperwork reasons that I would not bore you with. And I was like, I'm homeless, like legitimately homeless, you know. And because at the time my parents were moving, and where they were moving to had less bedrooms, so like my brothers were still living at home, and I was like, there's literally not enough room for me to move back home even if I wanted to. Like, I would be living in the living room at this point, you know. So, and my sister was getting married and getting ready to move in with her future husband, and it's just like the feeling of unknown was just massive for me, and I would try so hard to like trust the process and trust God, but probably the amount of times that I would text Sean and be like, I'm gonna lose it because I haven't heard from you in 3 weeks, and like I know you probably still don't have an answer, which he didn't, but like I need something because like my lease on my current apartment is up in a month, and like I can't afford to renew it unless you promise me a job, basically, you know. So it was just a lot of limbo. And then a week after that, I got a call from the RD boss individual on campus, and she was just like, hey, I kind of felt bad for like giving you mixed signals, so I'm gonna put you up in I guess a temporary apartment where you're sort of going to be an RD, but you're kind of going to be like the assistant to the RD of that building. You still get free rent, free apartment, like free meal plan. The downside is that your room is on an all guys floor, and you have to walk down a flight of stairs to shower or use the restroom.
Tough.
And your room, like an RD apartment obviously has its own kitchen, its own bathroom, all this stuff. Like I was basically getting a dorm room, the equivalent of a dorm room, on an all guys floor, and it was on the 3rd floor too. So I was just like, I have to move all my stuff up 3 flights of stairs in a building that doesn't have an elevator, like. And then the first week that I moved in, of just icing on the cake, the AC in the building completely broke, and it was the end of June. So I was on average going to sleep in anywhere between 78 and 85 degree temperature.
Golly. Girl, you were going through it.
Yeah.
This is one of those moments where I feel like, you know, you read those verses at some point, like you're probably going to a service and somebody reads the James 1, 2 through 4 where you're like, where they're like, consider it pure joy when you're struggling, and you're just there like steaming, like I am not
100%.
Considering it joy.
The amount of conversations that I would have in front of my mom of just like being in tears and being like, I don't know if I can do this kind of thing, like, and she would be like, just keep holding on, and I'm like, that's fine if you saying that, but you're going home to AC.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going home to not AC and also no answers. But for me, like, and I'll be honest, like, because a lot of times people have that silver lining of like, oh, I kept hope, and like I don't want to say I didn't, but I definitely had moments of just being like, is this worth it in the end? I don't have any answers. You know, I could be applying at a multitude of jobs right now, but I'm being told to wait.
Yeah.
Like, so I go back and forth of telling people that story because it was such a struggle for me to be in that limbo stage. I mean, as like, you've known me for years, like I plan 5 years in advance minimum of things, and I think at the end of the day, like that was like a first scenario of God being like, hey, this is the first step of you trusting me ultimately, and there's going to be a lot more steps in the future where you're going to have to trust me. So this is me like ripping the Band-Aid off of showing you I will provide for you no matter what, but I need you to actually trust me and just lean into my calling for you, because there's going to be future things that you question me on. And because I'm coming through for you in this situation, you're going to constantly be able to look back on it.
That'll preach. Come on. In
the time, I was like, I don't want to hear it. You know? But interestingly enough, like I was in that dorm room. Let's call it what it is. I was in that dorm room for literally a month and like a few days. And then I got a phone call from the RD boss, and she was like, hey, this is super awkward. And I was like, she's literally going to kick me out. Like I was there. And still hadn't heard from Sean, like, you know, and I was like, oh my gosh, like we were at this point in halfway through July. As you know, students moved back on campus at the beginning of August. So I was like 2 weeks out from like giving up, basically. I was like, if I don't have a job by the start of the semester, then, you know, at that point I need to start looking for something else. So she calls me up and she's like, hey, this is super awkward, but the RD that we hired to like gave the job to in place of you, they just resigned. Like literally they lived on campus for a month and then they left. And she was like, would you accept the RD position if I offered it to you? And I was like, yes. Oh my gosh, yes. And thankfully by this point, like the AC was fixed in my building, like, so I had been comfortable, even though again I was in a dorm room, not an apartment, on an all guys floor. But she was like, I just hate the fact that you're gonna have to move again. And I was like, I will move anywhere other than where I am currently living, you know. So I moved twice within a month and a half, and it was, the second move was the best move ever. Moved into Kendall Hall there on campus, and then not even kidding, 48 hours later Sean calls me. So I am, you know, having this conversation. She's like, okay, well, you can move in by the end of this week. You know, after I get off the phone with her, 48 hours later, Sean calls me into his office, and says that the college administration approved my job, basically. I was 100% making pennies on the dollar, but I didn't care at that point. I was like, they said yes, you know, this is God opening that door for me ultimately. So even if I have to eat ramen noodle for the next year to make it by, like, I know that I'm living into my calling ultimately. I stayed at Starbucks to help make ends meet and everything, but that start of the semester was just, it was so interesting to me because it was like surreal. Like you have those moments that you look back on, like when you get married, like you'll have that moment of like, I look back on my wedding day, I look back on my college graduation, I look back on this moment. And some people are like, well, it was just a job, like why would you look back? And again, I go back to the fact that like that was the first moment of me really not necessarily questioning my faith as far as like questioning the existence of God. Never had that moment in my life, but I was questioning like his calling for me. I'm like, did I get it right? Did I hear you right? And when I both heard the yes for me to move into a resident director position, as well as heard Sean say yes, like you're getting the job basically, it was just another moment of reassurance that like, okay, I'm going in the right direction. And like the crazy thing is like I was an assistant for a year, and then again CM just continually grew to where my part-time hours, like I don't know if I ever technically worked part-time hours at the college, even though that's what I was being paid for, but like within one academic year I was being promoted to a coordinator position and being promoted to full-time, and you know, having to fill out like health insurance, and I'm like, I have no idea. Like I am 20 years old and just like, okay, I'm making it, you know. And then was a coordinator for 3 years, and then Sean approached me again. He always has the exact same facial expression. 100%. Like I tell you what, like before I got promoted both to coordinator, being hired originally, and even to director of CM, leading into that, like, he had the exact same facial expression of, like, oh, well, like, I think I'd like to meet with you tomorrow, you know? So now it's just, like, I just know. I'm like, just tell me I'm being promoted at this point. I don't care. I don't care. And that sounds so, like, egotistical slightly. But yeah, he, a full 3 years after that, approached me and was like, hey, I know it goes without saying because we're a department of 2. So you've been doing the work of a director-based position for years now, but now the college really wants to give you the title of it. So you're going to be the director of campus ministries. He was like, not that you're here for this reason, but technically you're the first female and also the youngest individual to be within this position in the college's history. So I was like,
let's go.
Well, that's cool, you know. But again, not that I needed the promotions to stay necessarily, but again, it just showed God giving me that reassurance of like, you're where I want you to be. And continually at my time at Wesleyan, it felt like not only there on campus, but also within the community, just of partnerships and individuals and connections that I made, I almost became, I don't want to say the spokesperson for college students by any means, but I became a resource for like a lot of church individuals or non-for-profit individuals or just people there on campus of like, well, you speak college student, you know, like you're not only an advocate for them, but also you see them on the daily, like you work with them on the daily. So like, how should we structure our church's college small group, you know? So it was just so interesting that by the time I was director of campus ministries, and by that time Sean was on a VP level there at the college, like I was like, I feel like I blinked and I ended up here.
Yeah.
You know, like, yes, there was some struggle and, you know, ebbs and flow and unanswered questions, but like, my gosh, did time go by so fast.
A couple different important things that have like popped up throughout you telling this story. This most recent one here, I think of like literally the Israelite people, like talking about the idea of questioning like the calling.
Yeah.
And it's like, you were called out of Egypt. Like God promised you the promised land. But there's certainly going to be those moments where you're like, God, did you really? Like, it literally says that when they're starving, like, God, did you call us out of Egypt just so we could starve out here? Like, it would have been better off in Egypt.
Yeah.
And we all have those moments of doubt where we're just like, God, I thought I was on the right path. But the moment we start struggling or we feel like something's taking too long, it's very easy for us to just start questioning God.
And they were in it for 40 years.
Yeah.
Like, could not imagine.
It takes a lot of faith to be able to see, and you mentioned this, like looking back on like now it's a lot easier being able to look back on and saying like, hey, God ripped that Band-Aid off because at some point you're gonna have to trust me. And it's just one of those things where the Israelites, for example, like they had the pillar of fire, they had the manna, they had all this stuff, and it's like, at what point are you going to be someone like later, like Caleb or Joshua, who were the people who were down to still go despite seeing the giants ahead? Like, at what point are you going to say like, hey, I know it seems crazy, but like God has gotten us this far, and if we really believe, like if we just say, I believe God wants me to do this, I believe God wants me to go here, then I believe he's going to make it happen. I just might have to figure something out on the way, like it might not work,
right,
whatever that looks like.
Right.
And then the other thing is, you talked about at the beginning, like that harshness of there's nothing for me anymore. Like leave, like at OCC, like you graduate high school, like what is there for me? And I think that's something that we see all over the country, really.
Absolutely. Is
just this age group. Like you get out of high school and for some reason there's just a disconnect. Like, where do you go?
Yeah.
And a lot of people are finding different avenues to go down, and just finding it hard to find like a group of people that you can connect with or have community with. And I think a lot of that comes from just our culture today, feeling like you should go on your own and be independent and find your truth. And it's less, hey, when you graduate, you need to find your people.
Absolutely.
And it's more about, you need to get on your grind and do your thing.
Right.
And it's just creating this sense of isolation in the first place that makes it difficult for churches to even try and establish some sort of like just group of like our age people.
Yeah.
So you, though, now in that position, tell me about like what drew you more to this position. Obviously you just talked about like how you got the position and stuff, but like what makes you want to stay here? What makes you so passionate about speaking with college students? You said that you feel like sometimes you feel like you're a voice for college students.
Yeah.
What draws you to this age group, I guess, or what draws you to just this type of ministry that you're in?
Well, not only my own experiences of just not wanting somebody to experience what I did, because even from the academic side, like something I didn't mention was like my senior year, all within like the ups and downs of everything going on, some of my professors approached me and basically told me, not even kidding, like, you need to change your major and you don't need to be a music major because you're never going to make it. You're female, you're young, it's hard to make it within the music industry, and not to mention the fact we know that you want to go into ministry. I didn't even want to like go to Nashville and like live it up, you know, like I was like, ministry is the direction I want to go in. And I made that very clear even upon like my application to Wesleyan. And I had multiple professors my senior year tell me, you are never going to make it. Like, you're never going to be hired at a church because churches are predominantly like male led in their hiring process. Not to mention the fact you're graduating 2 years early. So you're graduating college at 21. Who's going to hire a 21-year-old with currently little to no experience, with only a bachelor's degree, essentially? And, like, I remember leaving those conversations in tears of like, God, is this truly what you want for me? And again, over and over again, I felt him say yes, like lean into me, lean into my reassurance. But like, I had very few physical human beings
Right.
on my side, essentially, on the side that I felt like God was calling me to. So that's a huge thing of like, when you're in college, the whole point of college is, and sometimes like you have a career change in the idea, but like the whole point of college is to lay the groundwork of what will likely be the rest of your life, you know? So if we can't both on the academic side, but also on the spiritual side, get that right of understanding how influential ages 18 to 24, 25 maybe are within somebody's life, like we've completely missed the boat in my opinion. Because if we can't understand like, hey, this person for the first time is not under their parents' roof, maybe they know how to do their own laundry, maybe they don't, like maybe they know how to balance a checkbook, maybe they don't, I have no idea, because everybody is coming from different backgrounds and different family atmospheres. Maybe they own and grow and like own their own faith already, but maybe they've never stepped foot in a church ever. So college is very much for first experiences, and something at CM that I firmly like believe in is the fact like we don't push a specific narrative of faith denomination, I'll say. Like we don't necessarily push the Methodist denomination because Wesleyan is Methodist based. Like we present multiple denominations, and we are way more of like, we want to live of how Jesus lived first and foremost, and then ultimately it's the student's job to figure out where they stand on the other topics. You know, we really don't discuss controversial topics within that atmosphere because we just don't see it being a time or a place for it. We're there to set the foundation. So a huge reason of both why I started within college ministry and why I remained, I mean, now going into year 8 ultimately, is because I think it's one of the most influential times in somebody's life of them deciding what they want to learn, what career they want, maybe potentially like meeting their spouse or getting married while in college or just out of college. Like they're figuring out how to date, they're figuring out how to be a spouse, like all these brand new things. And I'm like, how could we not aid them in that, or aid anybody in that ultimately? And also, if we're not teaching them that Christ has to be the foundation of their lives for them to move on ultimately, then we're setting them up for failure. Yes, it has to be their choice. But the thing is, up until that point, potentially, their parents have told them that it's not their choice. Like, me both growing and being raised within the Bible Belt, like, church was not up for debate, ultimately. When I went to college, that was the first moment of quote-unquote freedom that I had experienced, because my parents were like, as long as you live under our roof, you're going to go to church. So it was like, well, when you move out, you can make your own decisions. Well, what's the first point in somebody's life that they move out? College. So, and oftentimes if a student is moving like hours away to go to college, they have no accountability that they had for 18 years of their life up until that point. So if parents themselves are not even preparing their kids for it, then if college isn't preparing them for it, then what do we expect from them from like a societal standard ultimately? So that's been something that always weighed on my heart ultimately, because I experienced that. I 100% appreciate the fact that my parents were like, you need to make this decision for you. Very much agree with that. But had I gone to a college that was not grounded in the faith, that didn't have a ministry department, that didn't have a Sean Toms ultimately, like, I don't know where I would necessarily be, because unless I chose to continue going to church, potentially a church that did not have anything for my age group, then I feel like I would have just gone through the motions ultimately, maybe, and I really don't know where I would be today. And maybe other people have different experiences or opinions on it, but if we are not putting forth an effort to teach young adults how to not only just own and decide what they want from a faith standard, but also decide what they want from an academic standard. Like, how many people do you know that went to college and never used their degree for what they went to college for? And I'm like, college cannot just be this spinning wheel of like, we have an intake and we have an outtake.
Right.
Like, it has to be, you are not only owning and growing your own faith, but you're owning your calling and your education, and you know, you're owning what God is calling you to do within the world itself. And maybe that looks like you going into full-time vocational ministry. Maybe that looks like you going and being an educator, or you going into physical therapy, or you being a vet or a doctor or anything. But if you're going into a field and you make it all the way to your senior year, and then you decide that you hate the field that you've been going in, that's thousands of dollars wasted.
Right.
And you're like, well, I guess I can continue doing this because it's what the piece of paper says I have a background in.
Yeah.
But imagine if we had a type of administrative counseling like their freshman year or even their senior year in high school, to be like, hey, you're going to take some classes intentionally to see if you like or dislike this area, and then based off of that test results, like, this is going to determine maybe where you want to end up in life. And we're just going to give you answers at the end of the day. We're going to give you information, but then it's up to you to decide what to do with that information and where you want to go in life. So
yeah. There is a strong amount of like pressure for commitment, I think, in college. Even as early as high school, people are asking you like where you're going to go to college, what you think you're going to do one day, like, do you know where you're going to live? But even once you get to college, like, imagine being someone who's like mainly going to college to play a sport, and you're still getting that feed of like, okay, well, what are you going to do to make money? Like, where are you going to go?
Right.
And it's like, you've got 4 years to do it because it is so expensive.
Yeah.
So if you don't figure this out in 4 years, like the rest of your life, and having that pressure, it makes you either A, not want to commit to something at all, or B, commit to the first thing that seems somewhat good, and now you're locked in, and you better hope.
Right.
And I think too, talking about like the idea of how important our stage of life is, and like if your parents aren't doing this for you, I think there is such a disconnect today, partially just because when you think about like maybe let's say 100 years ago, what it was like between a parent and a kid, the gap in technology wasn't quite as big.
Right.
Like there wasn't as much happening.
Right.
But now like parents are having children with like cell phones and stuff and computers and YouTube and TikTok, and it's like they didn't experience any of that. And so the ability for an older generation to try and minister to the younger generation is just so much harder because they're living such different lives.
Yeah.
And so in ways it does feel like we have to have this intermediary area of people kind of like my age, your age, a little bit older, a little bit, to try and say, hey, like we're kind of in both worlds here. We're not quite like Gen Z or whatever, but we're not quite millennials. We're like right in the middle. Like we relate to both of these things. And at some point someone has to like break the cycle. Yeah. Because if your parents were ministered to poorly and then they minister to you and kind of fumble the bag a little bit, and then their kids, and it keeps going and keeps going. It's like, at what point is someone going to step up and say, hey, I'm going to be so intentional, even if it's not a parent, it's a campus ministries director. Yeah. Say, hey, I'm going to try my best to, even for just one family, if I feel like I've succeeded in ministering to this one person on this campus, for the rest of their generations, like I've broken the cycle where now there's going to be a bit more Jesus in their lives. They're going to have this more firm foundation versus a continuation of, well, my parents never made it a priority, and now I'm not going to make it a priority for my kids, and so on and so forth. And there's probably a lot of pressure there from you, or for you sometimes, of just like, you know, a little bit of weight on your shoulders, knowing like, hey, someone comes to my office and they're having this issue, like, what am I going to say? Because they are in this stage. It's exciting, like, oh man, this person's in this stage where I get to minister to them, and they're going off and who knows what they're going to do. But there's also probably a little bit of that pressure of like, oh man, like whatever I say to this person in this moment, like I could be affecting the rest of their lives. So even just today, you were a little bit late getting here. You're a busy person. You love what you do, but I mean, everybody has days where it's busy, it's stressful. Man, you've got different priorities on the campus, and not just in ministry, but you're working with other departments of the campus. You're doing AV for different parts of the campus because you've been in audiovisual stuff and doing tech. You're also volunteering at your church. You're active in your church. You've got a family going on. You've got cats. Like all these different responsibilities in your life. How do you feel like you balance the idea of like, hey, I love what I do, but there's definitely still probably going to be days where you want to pull your hair out and you're busy, or something didn't go your way, or you're late to something, there's too much going on? Because especially today, you know, with again like cell phones in your hand, like it's a blessing because you're like, man, I've got tech and I can do this, and I'm able. It's a gift. But at the same time, you've probably got 50 different opportunities for people to text you and say, Anna, I need you here. Anna, why aren't you here? Why aren't you there? And there's probably just a lot of different stuff going on. So how do you feel like you deal with the days where it just feels hard or it feels like too stressful? You're like, man, God did call me to this. I love it. I can talk about it positively, but man, there are probably days where it's just too much. Like, how do you go about navigating through some of those phases?
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm human. You know, I make mistakes. I miss meetings. I'm late to meetings. But something that, again, that I have at least attempted to live by to the best of my ability. Sean told me this maybe when I was a student, because I've always been very organized, administrative, maybe borderline OCD, probably a lot of OCD. And I remember sitting across from Sean. It was probably my junior year, and at the time he asked, it may have been my senior year, I can't remember, but he asked from every student within CM to give 1 hour a week for office hours. It was just an expectation, like, oh my gosh, who can't give 1 hour a week kind of thing. So I remember him sitting on the couch there in the old CM office in like the lobby area, if you would call it that, like the very front room beside Tab Scott. And he was like, hey, Anna, like, we're a couple weeks into the semester and I still haven't gotten your office hour. And I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, I like forgot to give that to you. I was like, let me pull my calendar up. So he was sitting there, and I pulled my calendar up, like it was color coded, obviously. And again, keep in mind, like, I'm still working at Starbucks. I have 2 internships. I have I think a 21 credit hour class load, both my junior and my senior year. And it was just like a lot in addition to like some family stuff with my grandparents going on. And I was like, well, is it possible for me to break the hour into 15-minute segments? Like, because I've got 15 minutes here and 15 minutes here. And he just was like, crazy. I think you don't have to do this, you know? Let's just like not have you. Well done, Sean. And I was like, no, I can do it. Like, I wanted to, like, you know, meet the expectation of the job, like, of the internship that I had said yes to. He was like, no. I was like, okay, like, but if something frees up, like, I'll for sure add it. And he was like, okay, we'll have, you know, and it's just like my entire junior and senior year, he, like, Sean himself talked to me a lot about balance, you know, and something that I have come to understand, and this is huge when you start dating and you're getting married, because again, you're adding a whole human being to your life that you have to commit time to, and if you marry them, they in many ways come like the top of your priority. So like, my entire singleness, like, had lived where I was running at 100 miles an hour. And I just never thought of it. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm fine. Like, I can survive on 5 hours of sleep. Like, I'm totally fine. You know, I'm getting up at 4 every single morning to work at Starbucks. I'm studying at 11 p.m. at night because I have a final the next day. Like, and like, I did experience moments of frustration or burnout or just complete exhaustion kind of thing, of asking myself if it was worth it. And even though my life now, obviously, like, I'm not in school, I'm not a college student anymore, but it looks different, but it's still in many ways kept the same pace. And the best that I can say is, if you're living, and this sounds very, if you know Sean, it sounds very like a Sean answer. But if you're living into your calling, the time will ultimately not make sense. Like, I have gone into meetings with students, I have gone into 21-hour work days before, and when I lay my head down at night, like, I don't feel tired. Or when I leave a meeting with a student that just lost their parent, or maybe their parents are going through a divorce, or they don't even know if they can financially afford college, you know, like, and I'm able to give them some amount of reassurance in some way. Like, I leave that meeting obviously in a way heavy for them, but I leave knowing that I impacted them some way. So when I go home, oftentimes late, and again, my husband, like when we met and started dating was when I was in my master's program. So he jokes around to people by saying that I dumped him before we ever started dating because we met and he was like, oh my gosh, like let's go on a date, like let's see where this goes. And I literally backed out like 4 hours before the date. And I was like, I can't do this. I was like, I have too much on my plate. I'm in my master's program. Like he at that point already knew the hours that I worked on campus and my commitment level and all this stuff. And I was like, I want to be able to commit time to this relationship, and I can't in good conscience say yes to just one date, because by that point we had been talking for a long time and knew a lot about each other, where I was like, dude, this could like be it for me. But it's just not the good it's a horrible time. Like it's horrible. And I had just started my master's program. I was like, I am crazy if I am expecting to start a relationship that I could potentially be married. Like I think the statistic is like if you start a relationship with somebody that ends up being your spouse, statistically is that you're married within 15 months or something like that. And I was just like, I can't do that.
The fact that you know that stat, first of all, is very Anna. That's a very you stat to just know.
But yeah, anyway. But so the interesting thing is like after bailing on not really my husband and I's first date, and then like not speaking to him for basically a month and a half, and then him reaching back out, or I reached back out and I was like, okay, I feel like I should probably be more honest with you because I gave you a very like I'm too busy answered, and that was the truth. But I was also like, I didn't want to tell you that I had an amount of confidence within the possibility of this turning into something, because that sounds like, who says that before even a first date kind of thing. But I was like, I need you to know what my life currently looks like truly. So I just like laid it out to him, and I was like, I can't change the fact that I'm in my master's. Like I have to write papers. Like I was writing 20-page papers every single week. I can't change the fact that I work on a college campus, that I work 40-hour weeks when on paper I'm working 20. I can't change the fact that I also work at Starbucks at 4 in the morning to make ends meet until I hopefully get promoted to this job that I love, you know? So his response to it was just everything to me, of him saying, he was like, first of all, like, props for everything that you're doing, like, to achieve and X, Y, and Z. He's like, I would never want you to say yes to me if it was going to add more stress. And he was like, but also, because I already care for you, I want you to achieve everything that you're already living into. He was like, I would never want to hold you back or anything. In many ways, I would want to simply live like hand in hand, step in step with you, and lean into your calling, like with you ultimately. He was like, also, I'm really low maintenance, you know? So like that was again God saying to me, hey, you're doing what I'm calling you to. So guess what? I'm going to pair you with somebody that also believes in what you're doing, you know? So that was really big for me. But do the days get crazy? Absolutely. Do I forget things? 100%. But something that Sean told me, like my senior year or something, when he was sitting beside me, he was like, God does not exist in chaos. And that has like stuck with me. I need to put it on like a throw pillow or something. It stuck with me to this day, because like, is my life busy? Yes. Like, do I have multiple hats both on and off campus? Absolutely. But something that I have found is if I can do my best in prioritizing adequately my life, and prioritizing in such a way where I feel like, okay, God, you're asking me in this scenario to put this student first. Will that make me late for this meeting over here? Yes. Is that meeting as important as this? No. Or will me staying late to work potentially make me late for dinner, you know, this one time? Yes. Do I have a husband that understands that? 100%. And all I would have to do is text him and say, emergency at work. And he would be like, no biggie. And also dinner will be ready when you get home, you know? So outside of yes, the occasional pop-up thing, like, yeah, I am very like strategic in how I plan and things that I say yes to and things that I say no to. I say all of that to truly agree by, like, God does not live in chaos. So he had asked us to structure our lives and to not be disorganized, ultimately. Mm-hmm. And sometimes individuals within ministry will be like, well, I just like go where the Spirit leads and wherever the wind blows me. And I'm like, hey, if your job allows that, props to you, but do I schedule meetings and have a color-coded calendar to this day? Yes. And in many ways I find that students appreciate that because they have so much uncertainty in their lives in all other areas that if I tell this student, hey, I'm going to be available for you on a weekly basis on this day at this time, and that's never going to change.
Yeah.
You have 30 minutes here and it's never going to change. So I find that structure for them does give them reassurance. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like, life is crazy and you do have to ebb and flow and you have to be flexible ultimately. But the more planning or the more structure that I can do on the front end, I feel like God in many ways ultimately calls us to do that so that we can also exist within flexibility when we have to. So
yeah, that's all good. I think about the verses I thought of when you were talking about just the idea of like maybe like missing a certain meeting for another meeting and like having that priority or whatever. Sometimes like prioritization can literally just be like prayer and peace. And I thought of the Matthew 6 stuff where he says like, why do you worry about your clothes? All this stuff, like don't worry about what you're going to eat. But at the end, he says, therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. It says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be given to you. So like the concept of I don't have to worry as much about tomorrow, like, or have that stress on me, because my priority is just like Jesus at the end of the day. And you're not necessarily, I'll just go with the flow, like God's going to guide me wherever. Like you said, I like that idea of I'm going to be intentional. I'm going to move with a purpose. But I'm going to understand that like my priority here isn't to be the best worker KWC's ever seen, or be the best employee, be the best wife, or be the best husband, or whatever it is. It's just my priority is Jesus, and I'm going to structure these things in a way that I think will be beneficial to that, to like kingdom building. And if in moments there's some sort of stress that comes up or something like that, it will be okay. Well, if Jesus is my priority, like what am I supposed to do from this? Right. So I'll end with this last question. I always ask, and I think you're like a wonderful person to ask this question based on your position and everything that you've learned probably from your years of ministry. But I always like to end with, what's one lie from the enemy that you feel like you just want to speak against? Like you have your moment to just kind of speak against it, whether it's something in culture or something people that our age or college students or whatever you feel like kind of believe, something that's put out on TV, something that you feel like is a common like misconception, whatever it is. But part of the reason we're Truthful Ministry is just because the truth is just that. It's the truth. THE, the truth. There's not your truth. There are a million truths. Jesus says in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so if something's not coinciding with the word of God or with what Jesus would want, it's not the truth. Right. And I think sometimes the truth can be hard to hear. Sometimes people don't like it. But sometimes it can also be like twisted, and people can kind of think they have the truth and can be very similar, but it's not it. And I think the enemy is smart enough nowadays to sometimes take something that seems really good or seems right and kind of twist it just enough a little bit to make it seem good, because you're like, oh, well, it seems close enough to the truth. But at the end of the day, the truth is the truth. And being authentic and being real here on this podcast, we always like to talk about just one lie that we feel like we've seen in our lives, because I feel like everybody has a different thing that they've either really been passionate about speaking against, or maybe they've experienced themselves, whatever it might be. But your platform for just a moment to say, like, here's something I see, here's a lie that I want to speak against. What do you think?
I would definitely say, like, the mindset of you can't do it, or like you're not qualified to do it, or your past or your upbringing means that you're a statistic at the end of the day. And statistically, you're not going to end up where your hopes and dreams are ultimately wanting to take you because of whatever. I mean, I fervently believe, yes, you should put in the time and the work, and like not necessarily expect everything to just end up on like your lap kind of thing. Like you should put in effort for things, and I feel like God calls us to that. But I even feel like when you look at how he acquired like his disciples, like he literally walked up to them on the street and was like, follow me. You know, it didn't matter their background, their upbringing. It didn't matter any of that. And not to mention the fact like that he called fishermen, he called tax collectors, he called everybody from every possible background you could think of. And he never once was like, well, let me see your resume, or let me see your papers, or let me see this, or like, I need you to prove to me that you're worth it at the end of the day.
Right.
Yes, we live in a different society where like, you know, college exists and job resumes and like that's the world that we live in, and in many ways have to play the game within, so to speak. But the amount of times students alone have come up to me and been like, man, I just got out of a class and like I didn't do super great, like I got a C or a C plus or whatever, and the professor's response to it was like, you know, you should really try shifting your major. I just don't see you being successful, you know. Now, are sometimes those conversations applicable? Sure, you know, because at the end of the day, like, I'll have a 45-minute conversation with a student, and at the end of the conversation, they're like, well, I really don't want to be a doctor, but it's what my parents want me to be. Like, I fervently believe if we live into our calling that God is calling us to do, not what our parents or grandparents or friends or what's popular, like, if we solely live into the calling that God has called us to, and yes, put in the work that God is calling us to put in, then ultimately it's going to work out, you know. And some people will be like, well, or this, or like, well, and I'm like, all valid, you know. I'm not going to say that there's not going to be ups and downs along the way. But again, if you truly believe that you serve the God of the universe, then why in the world do you not think that he can get you through college?
Right.
Why in the world do you not think he can open a door for a job? You know? So I would definitely say to people, like, don't stay within the conversations of people doubting you, or saying that you can't do something because you didn't meet this test score, or you didn't make this on the ACT, or you didn't, you know, excel very well within this area of life ultimately. If you fervently like prayed and everything and you really feel like that's the direction that God is calling you to, then I'm like, hey, just buckle down and do the work, and God's going to handle the rest ultimately. Too many times the older generation puts their opinion on the younger generation because of things that they were told growing up, and things that they were forced into, of saying like, well, when I was your age, I wasn't really good at that either, and I ended up doing a career shift or whatever. And I just want to talk to them and be like, but is that what you really wanted? You know, don't you wish somebody came to you and believed in you, or had your back, or even, you know, sat down with you and helped you study, you know, put in the time with you. Too many times I feel like if somebody's not good at something the very first time, then they're immediately met with doubt.
Right.
So that's what I would say.
I think there's just a world again with like social media and everything, and I think a lot of people lack patience. Yeah. And I'm definitely not perfect at having patience, but I think that comes on both sides of people having an expectation of like, hey, you're not good at this right off the bat, you should probably change. Yeah. But also even like the self-doubt of like, why aren't I already good at this? Because there are always the stories of the people who are like, oh yeah, this is my first time ever playing basketball and I scored 100 points or something. It's like that does happen. Sure. But we see that and we're like, okay, well, why didn't that happen for me? I must be meant for something else. When in reality, everybody starts somewhere, and it might be your calling, or it might be something you're supposed to do, but maybe you just haven't figured that out yet. That's totally perfectly acceptable. I always think about it too, especially with people our age. It's like the main focal point center of our whole faith is a guy named Jesus, who didn't start doing anything that we have of note until he was 30. Like, we don't, like, the only story we have is like, oh, one time he was at a festival and his parents didn't find him or something. Like, that's about it. Other than that, until he was 30, we don't know what dude was doing. But nowadays, if somebody said that, they'd be like, oh, dude, you're 30 and you haven't figured it out yet? What are you doing? And it's like, man, it's just such a United States specific, I feel like, cultural thing and 2024 thing in our time and our day and age. But there is for sure that sense of like, figuring it out fast and like, oh, well, I can't do this.
Right.
And you do hear that from a lot of people. Like, I think comparison is a big part of it. Yeah. Seeing other people and saying, oh, well, I have to find my thing that I can do this quick with minimal effort. Find my thing that it's going to be the solution. It's got to happen fast. And when you don't find it, there's always a different option.
Right.
Is another thing. You almost see it with like people who kind of church hop a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, there's always a different church, or there's always going to be a different job. There's a stat that I heard the other day that was talking about how often people around our age switch jobs. And it really does just feel like it's because, oh, well, there's always going to be a different job out there. Like I get to this one, I spend a month or two at it and I don't like it, I'm going to a different job.
Right.
Versus sitting down and saying, hey, like this is what I think I like, and even if I'm not good at it for a bit, or even if it doesn't look exactly like I want it to be right off the bat, like campus ministries.
Right.
It wasn't exactly like the most glamorous ministry when we first started, but it's like, I'm going to take my time because I'm here and I think I'm going to try and make it into something.
Right.
And even though you might have those moments where people say, oh, well, there were definitely, especially in campus ministries too, when we started off, like that feeling of all the time, and I'm not going to say I wasn't guilty of it every once in a while, of that thought of like, well, why aren't numbers going up? Why aren't more people coming to chapel? Why hasn't this been fixed? Or why don't we have a bigger budget for this yet?
Yeah.
Like, is anything we're doing even working? Like, maybe this isn't just going to work on this campus at all. Maybe we shouldn't do it. But you see where it's gone to now, and it's just that aspect of, man, like you're always going to face opposition, which is just also foundational in the scripture in general. Like, God sends down his son. God, who is God, has this ultimate awesome plan, and there's still opposition. There's still an enemy who's like, I'm going to be in your way. I'm going to try and tempt you. I'm going to try and do this. So why would we ever think that, oh, I'm just going to follow this route and I'm not going to have any struggle? I'm not going to have any struggle. Everything's going to be perfect.
And something that I oftentimes tell people, like, my story is not glamorous. It's not like, oh, I went to A and then I went to B and then I went to C and then I went to D and it was super smooth. Like, it truly wasn't. But the thing is, like, how influential would my story have been if there wasn't struggle in there?
Right.
And I'm like, I can look back and even share my testimony of like, hey, this is what I went through, and this is how I ended up where I am today.
Yeah.
Like, how relatable would I be if I never experienced any struggle from that point to now, to where I can now share my story, not only Wesleyan related, but like even outside of Wesleyan, and share some of the struggles that I have experienced, but then again show like God prevailed through it and God led me through it. So
amen.
Again, if we don't experience any amount of struggle whatsoever, like Christ experienced struggle when he was walking here on earth, like each of his disciples at different points in their life experienced struggle. Like, God never said you're going to become a Christian, your life is going to be easy. So if we then share our testimony and say, hey, this is what I've experienced, but all glory be to God ultimately, because he brought me through this. I just think it shows God's faithfulness at the end of the day. Whereas if our story was just easy peasy, lemon squeezy, like, I'm sorry, it doesn't really show God's faithfulness. It in a way just shows like, well, we just lucked out on the draw ultimately. Yeah. But if through struggle we still have faith and our lives still prevail, then I'm like, ultimately, I'm sorry, but that shows that we serve a God of the universe and not one that's just, I flipped a coin and then I lucked out ultimately. So, amen.
You're preaching right there. I'm going to read this verse and we'll end with this. This is 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10. Man, this is Paul in older words and 2,000 years ago saying exactly what you're saying. This is Paul saying, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why for Christ's sake I delight in weakness, in insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And it's just that idea of, man, when I'm going through these struggles, that's when Christ's power is most magnified. Because if everything was handed to me on a silver platter, people would say, oh, that's not God. You just, like you said, got the luck of the draw. Like you were just born into this lucky moment where everything was handed to you. You just happened to genetically be gifted in your sport, whatever it might be. But through the adversity, you can say, hey, I had everything against me, but how did I get through it? It's because of my God and how awesome he is. That's so good. That's some good stuff right there. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate this. This was awesome. Everybody out there, I hope that you got something from this. You might have to rewind, watch it back one time. This was good stuff. Join us again next week. We'll be here. Have a good one. We're out.